this. This will be the first time now in 40-some years that I've focused on this subject of Israel, especially the land. There are many of you, most of you, maybe all of you who attend this church, this congregation, have a special love in your heart for Israel, for the land, for the people, for God's purposes. That's more probable than not that every one of us. It's such an amazing thing. So this is the first of what I think will be 3, maybe 4. And I'm real interested, you might say, or I've got this imaginary couple that go out to eat, and after every service on Sunday, and they go out to eat, and they sometimes he roasts the pastor. Martha's his wife, and he explains to Martha or questions Martha, and I can almost hear him say, "Martha, what in the world does what he's about to say have anything to do with us and the time in which we live?" Well, that's a good question. I'm glad he asked Martha that, and I hope Martha listened in the service so she could give him an answer. So I think I would ask it this way. Why did in 2017, why was that the year in which Jerusalem was identified finally by a significant world leader, happened to be our president, President Donald Trump, identified and was willing to, in essence, move our embassy to Jerusalem, declaring in a very definitive way, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Why did it happen in 2017? And the answer is because of what happened in 1517. Because of what happened in 1517, and I can almost hear my church attendee say, "Martha, what happened in 1517? And I can almost hear Martha say, "Did you listen?" The reason the year 2017 is the year that Jerusalem was formally and officially recognized by a prevailing world leader, the reason it happened in 2017 is actually because of what happened in 1517. I'd like to try and explain. The title of this, I said, God tells, the qualities of God. What, to me, it has been through the years. What is one of God's many qualities that the Scriptures identify that is definitive in saying God is God? Really, as a pastor of a local congregation with a global call that we have, and we were told in a supernatural way that you better live Romans 12:12, which is to be a people who rejoice in hope, to be a people who are patient in tribulation when times are difficult, when there's pressure against you, and be a people who are really focused in prayer. Be those 3 things. And it's my intention, ultimately, why are you doing this? Why I'm doing this is to say your hope has to be in God. And the number one thing that I see that Scripture shows, apart from the Christ, which is what the whole focus of all the Scriptures are about, that the avenue, the vessel that God used to bring the Christ, the reason was our sin, but the vessel that God used was the nation of Israel. He had to bring it into being. He had to give it uniqueness. He's identified it as they are His witness in the earth. In the whole of earth, they're His witness of what? That He is God. So if you're going to have the ability to rejoice in hope, what I have found in my journey so far in my life, one of the things that gives me great confidence in God is what He has revealed about Himself through His interactions with the nation of Israel and their land, and obviously the seed, Christ Jesus, that He's brought through them. So ultimately what my intention is to give to you a reason, a basis to rejoice and hope in the calling and gifts and callings of God across the board, but the gifts and callings of God on us as a local church, as a people. and some sense of what's going on in the earth. I was raised in Florida, Miami, born in Miami, raised there. My parents moved to New Jersey when I was just a little guy, and they moved back when I was moving into the 8th grade. Moved back to Miami and went to the beaches some. I like to fish. I like to ride my bike down to the boats where the boats came in from fishing. But I enjoyed the ocean. But there was something about the ocean that I didn't understand and I didn't enjoy, and that's the undertow. The undertow, if you've been to the ocean, I'm sure you've experienced the undertow. And I've gone swimming in the ocean when I'd say, like, I'd go out here, and the undertow in a real short time period would have moved me down to here. Now, on the surface of the water appears to be coming, in this instance, I'll say, I'm on the beach. The motion, the momentum of the water seems to be coming toward me. If I'm on the beach and it's crashing on the beach. The undertow could be in just the opposite direction. The undertow could be left to right, and that's what I've experienced the most of. I remember one time I'd gone to the ocean and was swimming, and boy, I didn't take long that I looked up and I realized that my mom and dad, they were way down there, and the undertow had taken me quite a distance, but I didn't know it. I couldn't see it, but it was at work all the time. I want to use that and gravity as an analogy of the purpose and ways of God. They're like an undertow, that on the surface it appears like we as people, we understand what's going on, we know the reasons that things take place, and because we know the flow of the current, and and sometimes we just say, well, that was just circumstances that worked out. Had no idea that actually there was under the surface, there were purposes, there were laws, there were principles, there was an undertow that was moving things in that direction. And God does things like that. There's also an enemy who's seeking to do that, but I've chosen to major myself on God. So I say it this way, it's sort of the title, get past the title, Russ. God tells in advance. One of the qualities of God that he says, this is the thing that proves that I am God, is I tell you ahead of time what is going to take place. Not days, not weeks, usually it's years, sometimes it's centuries. I will tell you ahead of time what's going to take place. So when it happens, you will know that I am God. God tells in advance, and he sets laws and principles and undercurrents, I should have said undertow, that will bring about his intended purposes. There are factors, forces that have been set in motion by God that are the real explanation as to why such and such a thing happened, especially in regard to Israel, but it's true of all of our lives. So, unto that end, what if God, what if he chose a people, a nation, and set them apart because he was trying to teach everybody that he is God? So he's using a specific entity. He brings into being an entity, and he's going to use that entity as an example for all of mankind. He's going to use that example as a sign for all of mankind. He's going to use that example as a witness for all mankind, and he's going to use that people, that nation, as a vessel, a vehicle, a container, so to speak, through which he would bring about his purposes. He would bring it into being. Now, one of the factors at which he has done that's the nation of Israel. He has done that. And one of the ways to understand why do things happen the way they happen, why do things happen the time that they happen? Is it just random? Is it just circumstance? Or is there a God who has set things in motion, has called things into being, and that there's an enemy that's seeking to do everything he can do to mess up what God's purposes? But what if there's a people, a nation that God brings into example? One of my favorite, Otis gave one of his favorite, Isaiah 40 through 45, Probably if someone asked, do you have a whole section of Scripture that's your favorite section of Scripture? I'd say, well, yes, Isaiah 40 through 45. In that section, there are many declarations that to me just are hummers, and that I feel like have formed the inner woven into my heart, the strength, some of the strengths that God's woven into my heart. This is what he's saying of the nation of Israel. He's saying in the midst of them, and he was talking in context about calling things into being, saying things ahead of time, what's going to take place, and offering the real explanation for what took place. I'm offering that the real explanation for what took place in 2017 is what took place in 1517, is the real explanation. In Isaiah 43:10, God says, you are my, speaking to Israel, you are my witnesses, says the God, and my servant, they were his vessel, so to speak, that he was using in the earth, and my servant whom I have chosen. God chose them. He chose the nation of Israel to bring it into being as a witness to him, as a servant, as a vehicle, as a vessel, in order to accomplish his purposes, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. He has brought a witness, a demonstration through them that are for all of us, that are for them without a shadow of a doubt. That is for all of us, all of our lives. Verse 10, chapter 43. Before me there was no God formed, nor shall there be after me. There wasn't another one, there isn't another. There's a counterfeit. 43:11. I, even I, am the Lord, and beside me there is no Savior. 43:12. I have declared and saved. I have proclaimed that there was no foreign God among you. Therefore, you are my witnesses, says the Lord, that I am God. If you're going to rejoice in hope, and you have hope that's been placed in front of you by God, for my life, I have found this dimension of God, the land, Israel, the purposes, the calling, the cycles, the seasons, the numbers are so key in establishing the ways of God. So the ways of God. Teach me the ways of God. I want to speak of the ways of God. He tells you ahead of time what is going to happen. He tells you, this is what's going to happen. And there's no better example of Israel and that nation. Actually, the whole Bible revolves around a theme of which Israel, the nation, the Christ, fits into that from the very beginning, and that is sin, judgment, and redemption. What's really behind everything? Sin, judgment, redemption. Behind all of life, explain life, sin, judgment, redemption. That's the theme behind. What is the real core theme of the Scriptures? It's sin. The problem is sin. Judgment that sin has brought forth, the consequence of sin. Redemption. There is a provision that God has given to us. That's what the Bible's really all about, is that one theme. So does he start off by telling in advance what's going to happen? Yes, just as a brief example, Genesis 3:15. After the fall, after the sin, God speaking initially, when he questions and finds out, he knew, when he found out what was going on, what had happened, speaking, and I will put enmity or hostility between you and the woman, speaking to Satan, to Lucifer, to the serpent who beguiled Eve, and Adam followed her example, her lead. And I will put enmity, God speaking, or hostility, the New International Version. I will put hostility between you, that's Lucifer, the snake, the serpent, the devil, and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. God's saying, all right, here's what's going to take place. He had previously said to him, you're going to crawl, you're cursed more than any animal. But he gave him what the whole future was going to be about. I'm going to put enmity between the seed of the woman and your seed, the offspring of the woman and the offspring that you bring about in the earth. those those that are the offspring of the woman, those are your offspring. And he said it this way, and he, the offspring, he obviously was giving now the prophetic picture concerning the singular offspring of which we are called to be in him, to be in us, and through us Jesus is continuing to exercise and express that he is the seed of the woman that God was in this point in time in the Garden of Eden. He was telling the future in advance. I'm telling you, this is what's going to happen. There is going to be war, hostility, enmity between Lucifer, your seed, and her seed. And her seed is going to bruise your head. And your seed is going to bruise his heel. That's what's going to take place. That is the essence of the whole of life. The whole explanation is that God being God, telling you in advance what is going to take place, what is the real issue, what's really involved. Now, so he begins this nation. The nation begins, the vessel, the witness, the example that's going to take place. So he starts it with Abraham. This is Genesis chapter 12. And it begins, he gives Abraham the opportunity to start a whole new thing. He doesn't realize this, but he had to be obedient. He had to obey God. He had to follow God. Leave. You got to leave your land and to a land that I will show you. And you'll be a blessing. I'm going to bless you. I'll bless those who bless you, but you'll be a blessing. My intentions are, you got to leave. You got to follow me. I'm going to lead you to a land. It's really important. I'm leading you to a land. My intent, my overall purpose is blessing. I'm going to bless you. God tells in advance. Then a little later on in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham builds an altar to the Lord, and God speaks this to him, because he did it. He left, he made his journey, he actually got there, and God said to your descendants, I will give this land. Now, God's the creator. He made it all. He created the universe. Now, an easy way for people to say, it has nothing to do with God. Well, where did all this come from? There was a big explosion one day. Oh, okay. One day there was this big explosion. Yep. And everything came out of a big explosion. So all the mathematical intricacies of the universe, how everything stays in orbits, and they have stayed that way for thousands of years that we have record of, and there's a delicate balance, and there's intricacies, and the complexity is one of the things I appreciated in studying the ultrastructure of cells and so on. At the ultrastructure level is the magnificence, the order that's there. And so all of that came ultimately as a result of a big explosion. Bang! And there it all came from. That I'm telling you, it's easier to believe in God. That's just ludicrous. An explosion, and time. Enough time. Time. Well, if it wasn't billions of years, trillions of years. In trillions of years, there would be enough time for enough molecules to get together, and with a lightning strike, which is what's really believed, a lightning strike, and it'll strike this pool of amino acids, and all of a sudden will come a molecule that will be the beginning of life, and from it will come an amoeba, and ultimately Uncle George, that's the orangutan down at the zoo, it will all come from that. Right. To your descendants, I will give this land. What's an incredibly key component? God is giving a witness, bringing a witness for everybody. It's not just exclusively for them, it's for the whole of humanity, for the whole of mankind. God says, okay, I'm going to bring an example. I'm going to call a people, I'm going to call a nation, I'm going to tell them their future, because it's the way He does things. I'm going to tell them their future. And I'm going to give them a place, a location, and I can do that because I'm the Creator, and I have made everything, and I have deemed This is yours. I give you this land. One indication is how much opposition, how much hostility does it draw? Because in the very beginning, God said, I'm going to put enmity hostility between you, your seed, and her seed. You got to go to the beginning to understand, okay, what's really going on here? It's hostility between Lucifer, Satan, his kingdom, all who are under his influence, the kingdom of God, the seed, the woman, Jesus. Those are the redeemed who have been born of God, who have committed themselves to God. That's what it's all about. So why do you think it is Israel, Jerusalem, that's the single most contested real estate in the whole planet? Certainly there are those that are contested without a shadow of a doubt. But the most contested spot, it's 32 acres actually, the most contested 32 acres on the whole universe is the Temple Mount. Why? Because God said, I have given it to you. Now, part of the reason God did that, because He's given them a land, but through it, He's going to demonstrate, bring a witness, bring a testimony that He is God. That's the purpose. That's among the purposes. There are so many of them. And so Genesis 13:15, for all the land which you see, I'm not telling all the stories, just trying to give the point. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. I, God, gave it to Israel forever. It's theirs. Is it contested? Absolutely. Why? Because there's an enemy. It's absolutely contested. Genesis 15:7. I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit it. It came from God. He gave it to Israel. It is for them. It is for their future. It's for their history. But it's an example. It's a witness. It's a testimony. They're a vessel through whom God is bringing about His purposes. And Abraham was given a future. The future. So what's going to come up? But if God is God, one of the characteristics of God is He tells you the future. He tells you what's going to take place regarding His seed, the blessing, the land. He tells them. So I'm focusing on the land. So it's at a very critical point when Abram wasn't seeing any children by he and his wife, and he was real concerned by this time in his life. It's understandable. And so God said, I'll make you a covenant. Whether he understood fully all that meant, He was going to make a covenant. And during the covenant making that's reported in Genesis 15, He tells them the future. He tells them what is going to happen. So here's the future. Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. So He tells them, your descendants aren't always going to be here. They're going to be in another land. Now, He doesn't tell them how they get there. He doesn't tell them the route by which they're going to get back. He just covers the broad point is your descendants are going to be, they'll be strangers. It won't be their land. Are going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs, and they're going to serve those people in the land that they're in, and those people will be afflicting them 400 years. All of them teaching the flow of mankind, the flow of humanity. We know that God sent Joseph. How did they get there? We know, that's what we've been studying that for 3 weeks, looking at Joseph as for the whole purpose of stimulating you to trust God, to believe God, to stay the course, whatever the promises are He's given you, to hang in there. Don't drop out. Don't give up in the day of battle. It's God is the one who has called you to His purposes. God is the one who your confidence is in. So we've used Joseph as an example of someone whose life didn't make sense. It appeared it was shattered. But he was part of the vessel, Israel, the nation of Israel. He was part of the vessel through whom God was bringing His purposes. So he was going to illustrate His purpose, that God's intention, what do you mean? he took Joseph down to Egypt, had him sent. His brothers, they were trying to kill him. There's hostility. There's always going to be hostility present. They were trying to kill him. God, I believe, had the Ishmaelites. That's an interesting story. They come by at the right time. They take him down there. What's God's intention? To save the whole earth. His intention is to save the entire earth. Because the whole earth, every land, according to the Scriptures, was going to come under a famine. So he sent Joseph down there, a perfect type of Christ. Not perfect in every dimension, but an incredible example with so many aspects. As a type of Christ, to provide food, grain storage, to feed the whole world, that they would survive a time of famine, and they did. But the hostility came in, they forgot. Then new Pharaoh, he was alive for 110 years, and hostility arose. There were other pharaohs who arose who didn't know Joseph and weren't as cognizant of the massive miracle that took place, and they just saw all these Israelites growing, and it was one of the things God said, multiplication. He set multiplication in them. Why were they multiplying? Because it's a factor, it's an undertow. It's gravity that God set in motion. That they were going to be multipliers. Things would multiply. They would grow quickly. They would be blessed. Things would work out well for them, but not for other people. There's a problem. There's a problem, people would say. And they're going to serve them, God told the future. But in the fourth generation they shall return, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So God was telling the future to Abraham, the father. In Joseph's day, this is all that they knew. This is what he knew. They didn't have further revelation. What God gave to Abraham was, your seed's going to go to another country, didn't name it. They're going to be there 400 years, or they're going to be in servitude for 400 years. They were actually there at a minimum of 510 years because of the time of Joseph. But they're going to be there, and that they're going to serve them, and then they're going to come out. And God blessed the entire earth and the response of the earth. The hostility was, they became slaves. They came under oppression. And God was saying, you don't know everything. But I'm telling you, Abraham, he could have asked, who are the Amorites? The iniquity of the Amorites, another people. They were a people within the promised land, the land that had been given, God gave to Israel. Their iniquity was not yet full. So you mean in the purposes and timing and planning of God, one of the things that he's taking account of is other nations, other people, and their iniquity wasn't full. So it's not time for them to come back. You mean there are factors way beyond my realization, and God gives a glimpse of this. One of the factors why it's going to take the fourth generation, going to take 400 years, is because there's a nation, the Amorites. He could have listed many others also. Their iniquity is not complete, so we got to wait for that. The timing of God, what's being taken into consideration. So then the Bible goes to Genesis 37 to chapter 50. Here you have Joseph, Egypt, and the children of Israel. I have briefly mentioned that. And Joseph said to his brothers, now it's the end of his life. He's 110 years old. I am dying. But where's his confidence? Where's his hope? But God, I am positive. He heard. They passed on what God gave to Abraham. They had word of mouth at that time. I'm positive Abraham passed on to his son, and it got passed on. Isaac passed it on to Jacob, and Jacob passed it on to his 12 sons and told the story of what was going to take place. And Joseph understood, I'm positive, that the nation of Israel was going to be in another country. He had it figured out because he saw what took place. How did all this really happen, God? That he understood they're going to go back. They're going to go back to the land because it's part of the provision, the promise of God. And so this is what he said, I'm dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. He understood the land. He understood the promise of God that he was, and so here he's dying, and he said, you're going to go back. You're going to go back. And I think he would have known, boy, there's 400 years yet to go. At least there's 400 years. Because I'm sure that detail, that information got passed on. And you're going to go back. And when you go, take my bones. Don't leave me here. Take my bones. So the scripture, if you read the rest of chapter 50 of Genesis, they embalmed him and put him in a coffin. It says he was in a coffin in Egypt. And it was part of the big deal as they left now, years later, 400 and some years later, that they took Joseph's coffin. They took his bones, so his bones would be buried in the land of Israel. The future up to... So what happened? Abraham, God told in the beginning, you want to know what it's all about? Your seed is going to be at war with her seed. Her seed is going to strike you in the head. Your seed is going to strike him in the feet. An interesting thing, why do you think so many people are being beheaded? Why do you think beheading is almost the persecution of choice? I think it goes back to Genesis chapter 3. Because Satan was said, your head, he's going to bruise your head. So I think there's enmity, there's hostility, cutting off people's heads. So the future, God said the whole landscape. Now, the nation comes into being, the vehicle, the witness. And so the head, the leader, the founder, the first one, God, of course, would speak to him. That makes sense. And God says to him, now you need to understand this. He was making covenant 400 years, fourth generation. When the sin, wickedness of the Amorites is full, they're going to come out. So he passes that on. When Joseph died, that's what I think he knew. He knew, we're not going to stay here. God's promise, we're going to come out of here. He didn't know this long history, and take me with you when you go. Take my bones. So now, it's like the second major leader comes into being, and it's Moses. He's going to lead the people. He's the one God's chosen to lead them out of that time of bondage, Moses. God tells Moses the future till the end. So a part of the 5 books that's attributed to Moses tells about exactly what's going to happen, and it goes all the way to the end. Whereas Abraham and what Joseph had to work with was they were going to come out of a land of bondage. That much was known, and they would come out. I left the sentence, I just chose not to include it. They would come out with a lot of riches. They're going to be blessed by that nation who had them captive all those years. That's all they knew. But when Moses came along, Moses, in the writings of Moses, the first 5 books, we know a whole lot about what exactly is going to happen. And I put it this way, Moses in the Exodus, the revealings. God gave to him so many revealings, the factor and undercurrent, and there's a big one. And so for the next, this and 2 other weeks, the undercurrent, the undertow that I want to talk about is a factor that God identified, brought to reality, brought to the light. So it's like there's an undertow. He's saying to Moses, there's an undertow that exists in history, and it's constantly moving. And the reason history is going to move along like this, when people think it should move along like this, there's an undertow that's moving nations, moving things in this direction. And I have set those there's also an enemy. But I've set those nations in motion. There's an undertow. And he explained to them one of the most significant undertows that is in reference to Israel, or gravity that's constantly at work. And why is it at work? It is called the Jubilee. It's a factor. The reason Jerusalem was identified as the nation, as the capital of Israel, finally again, the reason that it was in the year 2017 was because of the Jubilee. That's why it was done. Well, why was it President Trump? Because God chose him. Well, boy, there's some real similarities just in the fact what's a key element of the Jubilee is the trumpet. Well, that's sort of an element of President Trump's name. What a coincidence. I kind of doubt it was a coincidence. I kind of think God did that on purpose. Why? Because it's just part of it. The factor, the undercurrent of the Jubilee was revealed through and to Moses. So here we go, Leviticus 25:9. Then you shall cause the trumpet. Robin talked about the trumpets. There were many ways. There was a very significant way among the ways trumpets were used. They were used for the things that she identified, absolutely. But there was a very, 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 it was only blown once every 50 years. The trumpets she was talking about were blown yearly under many feasts, many occasions, many assemblies. But once every 50 years, there was a particular trump. And this is not an elaborate teaching on the Jubilee. This is just opening the door to it. And you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month in the Day of Atonement, and you shall make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. Moses is telling them about it. And you shall hallow the 50th year and proclaim liberty. It was a fascinating thing. God set in motion a very unique cultural aspect. And you could look at it as, that was so strange. It was part of the Jewish culture that every 50 years there was a return and everybody got back the plot of land that was originally given to their family, and everybody got their family back, and if they were a slave, they got their freedom, and everybody came back to start, they all went back to start over again, and you have everything that you were originally given, and it's like, it was a phenomenal thing, and they had a whole lot of rules and so on that they had to follow, and people could say, it was just a real unique thing, and it was unique to the nation of Israel and agricultural, and it could be explained away. It really was just a real anomaly. It was an anomaly. It was a major undertow that was at work all through history, and it's the reason Israel got back to the land. When they were scattered everywhere into every nation, there was an undertow that was at work. What's its name? The name was the Jubilee. That was at work. That history, events, world decisions were being influenced, moved, carried along by a factor, a principle, a law, an undertow called the Jubilee. It can be looked at as just an anomaly. And it was supposed to take place. It never did work real good. Far from the truth. The future. Moses told him what's going to happen. He told him all the way to the end what's going to happen. In the first 5 books of the Bible in Deuteronomy. And among them, he was saying to them, you have special privileges. You have special responsibility. You have phenomenal rights. You have phenomenal consequences. You're an example. If you follow my ways that I will identify to you, you can't believe what's going to happen. So good. If you don't follow my ways, you can't believe what's going to happen. The consequences if you turn your back on me. Why was it so intense? Is it an example for all of mankind? Absolutely. Because they were chosen as his witness. And if they didn't follow him in Deuteronomy, which is the last of the 5 books, and there are places in Deuteronomy that it's realized this was his kind of final speech, talk, time period of communicating to them. He was telling them, this is what's going to take place. And it says, and the Lord shall scatter thee among all people from one end of the earth even to the other. Now, they hadn't gone into the promised land yet because Moses didn't go into the promised land. So they're all gathered together, this is toward the end, those that have made it through the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And so they're all there, and they're getting ready to go in, and he's telling them the future. And the day's going to come when you, and what he meant was the generations that follow you, that follow them, that follow many generations. But they're going to be scattered everywhere, every nation, nations that don't even exist at the moment. He told them the future. And there you shall serve other gods, which neither that you nor your fathers have known, even wood and stone. You're going to start worshiping all kinds of things you never even imagined. Chapter 30. And then the Lord your God will turn your captivity, and he'll have compassion on you, and will return. When you see the word return, it is so frequently linked to the major undertow concept of the Jubilee. Return. I will return you. You'll return to your land that I have given you, and will have compassion on you, and will return and gather you from all the nations whither your Lord your God has sentenced you. So Moses was telling him, your descendants are eventually, the time is going to come, they're going to be scattered all over every nation. And then the time's going to come when they're going to be gathered again. And what was the regathering, return, restored to what God had given them originally? What was the mechanism, the undertow, the principle, the law? It was the Jubilee. Oh no, I thought the Jubilee just was kind of an unusual agricultural kind of rule that kind of existed very early in Israel, but didn't really have anything to do with anything. Okay? And the Lord your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it, and he will do thee good and multiply thee above your fathers. That's what's going to happen. It's a long time. It was thousands of years in advance. He told them what was going to happen. It's the ways of God. It was the nation. He said, you're my witness. I know what's going to happen in advance. Hold to what I've called you to. Stay steady. So what happened? They had two periods where, because of their disobedience and their sin, they were sent into captivity. The first one was about 600 before Christ, of which Babylon conquered them and took them to Babylon for 70 years. So I put AD 70. I didn't put the first captivity. This is the second. So they come back to the land, and eventually Jesus comes. And what do? The leadership, the religious, so on. What do they do with the Christ, the answer, the Messiah? They kill him. They crucify him. It was the epitome of the rejection of God's purposes and God's ways. So then, in AD 70, the second time of captivity, because of their rampant disobedience, and this was the apex of their disobedience, they killed the Christ. It was AD 70, Rome. Rome had the land. They had it for a time period. Then the Byzantine, it split actually in two, and the Byzantine Empire had part of it. They had the land. The land. What happened to the land? What was the law of the Jubilee? The law of the Jubilee was that when 50 years would come, on the 50th year, the owner of the land at that time period would have to restore it to the original owners, whoever owned it then. So what happened to the land after Rome kicked all the Jews out, burned Jerusalem, and scattered them everywhere? What happened to the land? Rome owned it for a while. Then the Byzantine Empire owned it for a while. Then in the 600s, the Muslim Omar, he had it, he won it. And then there were various Muslim rulers and caliphates, and there were a variety of things. There was a very short time period when the Crusaders came and they took control over Jerusalem, and so, but it wasn't long. And then the big one, the last one was the Ottoman Turks, Turkey. They were the last ones who had the land, who had control over the land that God said he gave to Israel. And it was taken by Selim the Grim. He killed his parents and his brothers and so on, so he could be in charge. And history calls him. If you really want to know what happened, there was a battle. I would call it Raid on Haya. It was near Cairo. It was in January of 1517. It's when the Ottomans took control from Turkey, Syria, they called it Palestine in that time, the land of the Philistines, and Egypt. The battle was in Cairo, Egypt. And the Muslim factor that he battled, that the Ottoman Turks battled at that time period, their headquarters was near what we refer to as Cairo, Egypt. And when they won, when the Ottoman Turks won, then they got Egypt, they got Palestine, and they had Syria, and they had Turkey. And they were the owners of it. They were the last owners before Israel. Now, I love this kind of question. How did it happen? And sometimes when I don't really know how it happened, I say, Fred did it. But how did it happen? Do you know? So the Turks got it in 1517. Then the undertow of the Jubilee got set in motion. How do you know? Because you got to add by 50. There's an undercurrent, an undertow that's at work all the time. And when you get to Jesus, you ultimately understand that the generation that they got their land back was the last one. So it had to run all the way till the last generation, which we're in. And how do you count? By 50s and by 7. Good Bible numbers. You count by 50, you count by 7. Come up with, to understand, why did it happen in that year? You got to count by 50, you got to count by 7. So, what was it? What was the cataclysmic event? The Turks had it 350 years. They got it in 1517 because they won a battle down in Cairo, Egypt. So they owned Palestine, kicked Jews out. I mean, they'd already been gone. It was illegal for a Jew to be in Israel, especially Jerusalem. They had no place. They were out of it. Moses had declared that's what was going to happen. You're going to be scattered to all the nations. But there's a time coming, and what's the undertow that governs all that? It's the Jubilee. You know, it's fascinating. Russia's involved. Russia? Yep, Russia. So what happened? You're going to think I'm teasing you, but this is a glimpse God gives us into what really happened. There were a bunch of Greek Orthodox priests and a bunch of Latin priests in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, Israel. Now, there were geopolitical factors at work for sure, but what was the straw, or what was the match that lit the straw that had been building? What ended the 350 years of Ottoman rule, the last owners of the land that God gave to Israel? It's part of the witness that God is God. He sets in motion the factors, and they're at work, whether you recognize them or not, whether you're willing to accept them or not. They're at work. They're an undertow. You can't see it if you're standing on the beach, but it's at work. It was over a set of keys. It was over an emblem on the wall that got stolen, a star. There was a representation of the Star of Bethlehem, and it has some Latin inscription on it. and there was some repair work that needed to be done on the cupulas, the domed lids over several of the areas, and they got into a big fight. The priests, the Greek Orthodox priests, got into a fight with the Latin priests, and the historical report I read, some of them picked up metal crosses, some of them picked up metal candle holders, and they went at it. They had a melee, the priests. As it is, the Latins had keys to the front door of the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And the Greek Orthodox only had keys to the side door. And they wanted keys to the front door. That is really how Israel ultimately got the land back? Because of some keys? Yep. Some keys and a missing silver Star of Bethlehem that had some Latin inscription that disappeared, and some arguments over who was going to do the repair work. Was it going to be done by Latins? Was it going to be done by Greek Orthodox? I mean, it's so comical. It's in the Church of the Nativity. Were Jewish people involved? They couldn't even get near it. But there's an undertow. It's always at work. What's the name of this particular undertow? The Jubilee. What's the Jubilee? God said every 50 years there's going to be a return. So it's working. What if sometimes God says you have to have 7 Jubilees in a row? And the 7th Jubilee, that's when it'll happen. In this instance, from the year 1517 that the Ottomans got control of Palestine, Egypt, and so on, if you count 750 years, that's 350 years. When did the first Jews be able to buy land in Palestine? Oh, that's 1867. You could look at that and say, that's in 1860. So what? Who cares? Well, that's 750-year time periods. So what? Who cares? Well, those are 7 Jubilee sequences. Who cares? I care. Israel cares. What happened? There was this argument among priests, and they got after each other with metal crosses and metal candle holders. Russia got involved, and they stood behind the Greek Orthodox. England and France, who were pretty good enemies by that time in history, they got involved, and they came together, and they joined forces with the Ottomans, and they came against the Russians in a very famous time of battle. Jeremiah explains in advance what's going to actually happen. Jeremiah, God tells you, sometimes you got to look a little bit, and you have to understand things are layered, and one passage can refer to this layer, but it also can refer to this layer, and also can refer to this layer, and it can also be the explanation of this layer. But you got to pay attention. So I got to back up. I've swiped it. Jeremiah 32:42. For thus says the Lord, just as I have brought all of this great calamity on this people, so I will bring them all the good that I have promised them. Should have more. And fields will be bought in this land of which you say it's desolate, without man or beast. What had Israel, now Palestine, what it had become? It was desolate. It was awful. During those nearly 2,000 years, and I'm just talking about the last 350. It was awful. It's desolate without man or beast. It has been given into the hand of the Chaldeans. Jeremiah was writing it of this most directly in terms of the Babylonian captivity. Men will buy fields for money, sign deeds, and seal them, and take witnesses, the land of Benjamin, in the places around Jerusalem, in the cities of Judea, in the cities of the mountains. That's what was going to happen. And so, in essence, Jeremiah was prophesying to them, it's going to take, and all the cities that followed and the cities of the south, for I will cause their captivity to return. So God revealed through Jeremiah, initially concerning the Babylonians, they're going to be able to buy the fields again. Now, that's going to really happen. How did Fred God accomplish that? It's a good question. I know what started it. So here we go. Some keys, a star, and repairs. That's what started it. It resulted in the Crimean War in 1853 to 1856. It was primarily fought up in Ukraine, the Ukraine area. It's called the Crimean War. What was it over? There were geopolitical factors, but ultimately it was some keys and a stolen or taken star and some repairs and some pretty angry Greek Orthodox priests and Latin priests, pretty angry at each other. Both of them wanted to have keys to the front door. I mean, that was a real biggie. That's what God used. Yeah, so that's it. So the Turks were in the war. The Turks were in the Crimean War. Russia was on one side, and on the other side were the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, and England and France. There was another country that was mixed in. The Turks, Ottoman, didn't have a whole lot of money. What really did happen? They didn't have a lot of money. So they had to borrow more money, and they were nearly at their debt limits from European countries. And so when the war was over, 1856, when the war was over 2 years later, they were facing catastrophic debt. And so they decided what they would do is they would start selling the land. But we will not sell it to strangers. You can read it. Just search the history. We will not sell the land to strangers. It can only be people who live in Palestine. They're the only ones who can buy it. Well, Jews, it was illegal to be in Palestine. How is God going to work around that one? So the first, it's called the First Turk Land Code. The purpose was, well, sell them land, then we can give taxes, then we can raise money, then we can pay our debt, then we can keep hold of this land. How did God do it? He's laughing up in heaven. He's saying, the Jubilee, it's at work. The Jubilee. It didn't work. It was only for residents when it was set in motion. So in June 10th of 1867, they set a second one in motion. That's an interesting date. 1867, the Second Turk Land Code. And they said, now strangers can buy land. Not just residents, but strangers. Do you know who the strangers were that bought land like crazy? Jews. They bought land. They were able, by whoever had ownership of the land, they were able to purchase from the last owners of the land, the Ottoman Turks. They won it in war. They were able to purchase land, and it began. The trickle began. When did it begin? 1867. They set a second land code, and now strangers could purchase land. Now, the reports that I read, it went on for a while. They used third party, four party, second party. Jews would band together and get a third party to purchase land, and the Ottoman Turks didn't know what was going on for a while, and when they finally figured it out, it was too late, and a fair amount of Palestine, what it was called Palestine then, belonged again to the Jews nearly 2,000 years later. And you could say, what did God use a key fight? Fight over the keys. Who had the front door key? Who had the back door key? You know, that might fly if you don't count. But if you count from the time the Ottomans took control over it and they won that fight down in Egypt, it's 350 years. That's 7 Jubilee years. I wonder why the Battle of 1967, when Jerusalem and the old Jerusalem was captured again by Israel in the Six-Day War. I wonder why it was in 1967. There's an undertow every 50 years. Count them. It's another 50 years. There's a factor. There's a principle. There's a rule. There's a law. There's an undertow that's at work. It's below the surface. You can't see it, but it's moving everything into the preordained purposes of God that He told through Moses thousands of years before. They're going to be scattered everywhere. They're going to come again because I give it to them. He had the right to do whatever He chose. You're my witness. You're my example on the earth. I'm giving it to you. What does that have to do with Jesus and me? The Jubilee has everything to do with Jesus. It has everything. Because He stood when He began His ministry after His time of temptation. And in His own hometown, He starts with the home folks, and He opens up and He reads out of Isaiah. And He says to them, today this is fulfilled, the favorable year of the Lord. They knew what the favorable year of the Lord was. It was the Jubilee. And Jesus was saying on that day, I am the Jubilee. He is the return to the provision of God, the purposes of God. He is the way for all of humanity, all to be blessed. How did the Jews get their land back? On the surface, they had a fight over keys, over a silver star, and over some repair work that needed to be done. That resulted in the Crimean War. That resulted in the Ottomans, who had the land, they had to borrow more money to pay for that war effort. And they ran out of money, so they decided they would sell the land only to people living in the land. And then when that didn't work, 9 years later, which made it to be 1867, they opened up the sale of the land to anybody. And Jews started to buy their land. Why? There's a God. He tells you in advance what's going to happen. He even told through Jeremiah, that was 2,500 years before. They're going to buy this land. It's going to be really desolate. It's going to be so desolate, so messed up. And they're going to pay money for it. They're going to sign deeds. It's exactly what happened. And there are some who say it has no relevance whatsoever. And I'm among those who say, no, it has everything to do with God and His intention and His purposes. And it's an example. It's a witness. It's a testimony. Because the real ultimate Jubilee that He's using the nation of Israel as a witness and example, look what He's done, is Jesus, the Jubilee. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. What was He declaring? I am. And He said to His own hometown folks in their synagogue, today this has been fulfilled in your ears. It's right now. He was the Jubilee.